6,700 people, loaded onto barges, dumped on a strip of swampland in the middle of a Siberian river. No food, no tools, no shelter. Within days, the guards on the riverbank reported something they could barely put into words. The deportees had begun eating each other. By the time Soviet officials finally intervened 13 weeks later, more than 4,000 people were gone, their bodies swallowed by the river, the mud, and a silence that would last over 50 years. To understand how this happened, we need to go back, not to the island, but to the office where one man signed a piece of paper. The year was 1933. Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union was in the grip of rapid industrialization. Cities were swelling. Factories were being built at a pace the world had never seen. But the cities were also filling with people the regime didn't want. The homeless, the unemployed, petty criminals, and anyone who couldn't produce proper identity documents. To Stalin, these people were social parasites, and he had a plan for them. In the spring of that year, a directive was issued from Moscow. It called for the mass deportation of, quote, socially harmful elements, end quote, to remote settlements in western Siberia. The idea was forced colonization, send the unwanted to the wilderness, let them build new towns, grow crops, and become productive Soviet citizens. It sounded rational on paper. What it became in practice was one of the most horrific atrocities of the 20th century, and almost no one has heard of it. By the end of this story, you'll understand why this chapter was erased, and why it deserves to be remembered. The roundups began in Moscow and Leningrad. Soviet police swept through train stations, markets, and bread lines, arresting anyone who couldn't show valid identity papers. Think about that for a moment. Not criminals, not political dissidents, people who had simply lost their documents or had never been issued them in the first place. Factory workers separated from their families, war veterans, students, even Communist Party members who'd left their papers at home that morning. They were all thrown into the same category, socially harmful, and loaded onto trains heading east. The conditions on those trains were already a death sentence for some. Thousands were packed into cattle cars with almost no food and no sanitation. By the time the trains reached the city of Tomsk in western Siberia, many had already died. The survivors, roughly 6,700 people, were transferred to open barges on the Ob River. But there was a detail that even the guards escorting them didn't fully understand. The settlement they were being sent to didn't exist. There were no buildings, no supplies, no farmland. There was only an island, a long, narrow strip of swamp and forest, barely 3 kilometers long, sitting in the middle of the Ob River. Its name was Nazino. The barges arrived at Nazino Island on May 18, 1933. What greeted the deportees was not a settlement, not a work camp, not even a clearing. It was a waterlogged spit of land covered in birch trees and thick undergrowth. The ground was soft, the mosquitoes were relentless, and the temperature at night still dropped below freezing. The guards unloaded the people onto the island and then did something almost unbelievable. They left. The barges pulled away. A small contingent of armed guards remained on the opposite riverbank, but their job wasn't to help. It was to make sure no one escaped. On the first day, the deportees received a single ration, a few hundred grams of flour per person, not bread, flour, with no tools, no fire, and no clean water. Many tried to mix the flour with river water and eat it as paste. It made them sick. Some died within hours. By the second day, the flour distribution descended into chaos. The stronger deportees attacked the weaker ones, stealing their rations. People were beaten to death over handfuls of wet flour. And this was only the beginning, because after that second day, the food stopped coming entirely. What happened next on Nazino Island was documented not by Western journalists, not by dissidents, but by a Communist Party official named Vasily Velichko. He was an instructor for the Narim Regional Party Committee, and he was sent to investigate rumors that had begun filtering back to local authorities. What Velichko found on that island shook him to his core. In his report, which was classified immediately and wouldn't surface for over 50 years. He described scenes that read like something from a medieval nightmare. Within a week of the food stopping, the deportees had stripped the island of anything edible: bark, grass, moss, insects. Then they turned on each other. Velichko documented cases of murder and cannibalism, not isolated incidents, not madness at the margins. Organized groups of stronger deportees were hunting the weaker ones. Bodies were found with flesh carved from their limbs. Some victims were still alive when it began. One account that appears repeatedly in the testimonies describes a young woman, a deportee who had been given some protection by one of the guards. When the guard was transferred away, she was killed and eaten within hours. Her body was found the next morning by the riverbank. This wasn't desperation born of weeks of starvation. This was day 10. Picture the island at night. 1,300 people had already died by the end of the first week. The living huddled in the mud between the birch trees, too weak to build fires, too terrified to sleep. The guards on the far bank could hear screaming carry across the water after dark. They did nothing. Some of them later admitted they were afraid, not of the deportees escaping, but of what was happening on the island reaching the mainland. The local indigenous population, the Ostiaks, who lived along the Ob, refused to go near Nazino. They said the island smelled of death from miles upriver, and yet, incredibly, more deportees kept arriving. A second barge delivered additional prisoners in early June, bringing the total to well over 6,000. Fresh victims dropped into the same nightmare. Many of them didn't last 48 hours. Disease swept through the survivors: dysentery, typhus, exposure. The Ob River, still swollen with spring snowmelt, flooded portions of the island repeatedly, drowning people too weak to move to higher ground. There was no higher ground. The entire island was barely above the waterline. Those who tried to swim to the mainland were shot by the guards. Those who stayed faced something worse. By late June, the Soviet authorities could no longer ignore what was happening. Local officials were panicking. Reports of cannibalism had reached the regional party headquarters. Velichko's investigation was already underway, and what he was documenting was politically explosive. The regime moved fast, but not to save the survivors. They moved to contain the story. The remaining deportees, roughly 2,000 of the original 6,700, were evacuated from Nazino Island and scattered across smaller settlements along the Ob River. But these settlements were barely more hospitable. Many deportees died in transit. Others died within weeks of arriving at camps that had almost no infrastructure. By the end of the summer of 1933, the death toll had climbed to over 4,000. Some estimates place it higher. The exact number will never be known, because the Soviet state did what it always did: it destroyed the records. Or tried to. Velichko's report somehow survived. He had sent copies to multiple party officials, including a letter directly to Stalin himself. In that letter, Velichko described the deportation as a catastrophe of criminal negligence. He named names. He demanded accountability. Stalin's response? Silence. The report was classified. Velichko was quietly reassigned, and Nazino Island was wiped from the official record as if it had never happened. For decades, Nazino Island existed only in whispers. Survivors, the few who lived long enough to grow old, rarely spoke of it. The Soviet state never acknowledged it. Western historians had no access to the archives. It wasn't until 1988, during Gorbachev's policy of glasnost, that a journalist named Alexander Solyakov traveled to the Ob River region and began interviewing elderly residents who remembered 1933. What he found confirmed the worst of Velichko's classified report. But here's what makes this story even more disturbing than it already is. The Nazino deportation wasn't an accident. It wasn't a plan that went wrong. It was the intended outcome of a deliberate policy. The deportees were never meant to build settlements. The logistics prove it. No supplies were ever dispatched, no construction materials, no seeds for planting. The people sent to Nazino Island were classified as expendable. They were the human waste of Stalin's utopian project, shipped to the margins of the empire to disappear. And they did disappear. For over half a century, they didn't exist. No memorial, no acknowledgement, no names carved into stone. Just a muddy island in the middle of a river that most maps didn't even bother to label. The Soviet Union didn't just kill these people, it erased them. So let's return to where we started. 6,700 people on a strip of swampland. No food, no shelter, no hope. Now you know who they were, not criminals, not enemies of the state, but ordinary people swept up in a bureaucratic machine that saw them as numbers on a deportation quota. Now you know what happened to them: starvation, violence, disease, and acts of cannibalism so systematic that even the party officials who documented them could barely process what they were seeing. And now you know the final, most damning truth, that none of this was a failure of the system. It was the system working exactly as designed. 4,000 people dead in 13 weeks. And the man who signed the order never answered for it. Not then, not ever. Today, Nazino Island sits quiet in the middle of the Ob River. The birch trees have grown back. The river has reshaped the banks. There is no monument, no plaque. If you went there tomorrow, you would see nothing, just water and mud and trees. But beneath that mud, somewhere, are the remains of people whose names were never recorded, people who were sent to an island to disappear, and for 50 years, that's exactly what they did. There's a question that lingers after a story like this. Not how could this happen? History has answered that question too many times. The question is how many other islands are there? How many other places where people were sent to vanish, and did, so completely that even their ghosts left no trace? The dark ledger has many pages, and some of them are still waiting to be opened.